Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. The collapse of the Soviet Union was widely perceived as a historic triumph and validation of capitalism, only to see it enter a major crisis less than 2 decades later. And while the number of those who were forced to bite the bullet by the recent crisis is comparable to those left poor by the crash of communism, a critical analysis of flaws and merits of capitalist system is still fairly rare. Well, to attempt to do just that, I'm now joined by Jeffrey Sommers, an associate professor of political economy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Sommers. I know that you are a frequent guest here in Moscow, and
Yes.
later on today you will be speaking on what awaits the world after the end of American imperialism, which I think is a kind of topic that will certainly resonate with many people in Moscow. But I assume that for many Americans, it's not just a provocative topic. Some may perceive that as simply unpatriotic on your part.
Well, I find that patriotism is rather weak in the United States today. But I think Americans are very weary. They're not particularly patriotic right now, and they feel under a great deal of stress. And so they're not really thinking in terms of patriotism in the way that they once did, especially during the Cold War.
Now, I think that there are a couple of words in the political science vocabulary, imperialism being one of them, that are sort of dirty. I mean, once you use them, you risk being classified as a conspiracy theorist or maybe an American hater.
Yes.
But as far as I understand, your main message is not so much about the end of America as a great nation, but rather the end of certain policies by the United States government that you view as no longer sustainable.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, I also find the term somewhat problematic because it's very value-laden, as you suggest. But what I'm very concerned about is the introduction of these austerity policies, frankly, which have been the primary response of not only the U.S. government, but also of the European Union to their crisis. And these policies seem to be spreading globally as a response to this crisis in the United States, the European Union, and increasingly the world. And I think it's very dangerous because
Why so?
We've done this once before. Now, a famous American literary figure, Mark Twain, once used to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. Well, in the 1930s, and actually in the 1920s as well, we had governments in Germany, Japan, and Italy all try austerity policies in response to crises which they experienced. And with all of them, within a couple of years, they opted for military fascist regimes as responses.
So you mean the suffering that people
Yes.
incur leads to radicalization of political climate?
Yes. That and the fact that you also had radical nationalists within their respective militaries who were not happy with just how much their nations were being weakened. So I'm not suggesting that we'll see an exact repetition of that, but what I am suggesting is that we're playing with fire by introducing these austerity policies. I mean, they're really, really hurting people. And at some point, somebody is going to come along with a message that resonates with the popular will, and we could see something that perhaps is not very democratic and perhaps quite unpleasant, as we did with Mussolini, Hitler, and the military regimes in Japan.
Now, in addition to austerity measures that have been introduced all around the world, in particular the Western world,
Yes.
we also see something that I would argue is a continuation of the old imperialist agenda. And what I mean by that is, for example, the United States is still very active in scheming certain military adventures, for example, in Syria. It still unquestionably supports Israel. It's still involved in some sort of shady deals with the Gulf states. So it is difficult to understand why would you think personally that we are seeing the end of the American imperialism, because all
Right.
those very expensive policies are still in place despite all the suffering that ordinary folks may
Right.
be subjected to.
Yes, well, I mean, the reason primarily is because the United States cannot just unilaterally one day decide to disengage from the rest of the world. But it is slowly disengaging. I mean, if we take a look at Syria, for instance, which you've mentioned, there have been pressures for the United States actually to engage much more intensively, but it has not. And one of the reasons, of course, is that the country is broke, and plus they're tired The American people are tired of these military adventures. And so while they are intervening, they're not intervening with the vigor and the strength that they have previously.
But I think the way they are intervening is quite consistent with the Obama's agenda of leading from behind,
Right.
because obviously they're still in talks with many of the countries in the region.
Yes, of course.
The arms are still being flown into the region, and
Yes.
for example, the Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are the main receivers of American arms, are also very active on that front. So they may not be intervening directly in terms of sending troops and having troops on the ground, but obviously the impact on the country of Syria, where the war is waging, is quite significant.
Oh, it is. I mean, I wouldn't differ with you on that. And again, I'm not arguing that they're completely disengaging. I'm just saying, just as you suggested, that the character of the engagement is different. And it does represent, though, a certain scaling back. I mean, when you don't send tens or even hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground, that's a different kind of engagement. And it does suggest a United States that is becoming more cautious and a bit weaker. So on the whole, I think this is actually a positive trend. I mean, I would like to see, of course, the United States disengage even further from some of these conflicts. But I do think that we would have seen a different kind of response if this were 10 years back. In other words, before the second Iraq War. So I think there is a bit of a change.
So do you think it is just because the United States is weaker financially that it can no longer afford that, or maybe because the decision was made that some old ways are no longer practical? That you can do the same thing, you can achieve the same ends by different, probably cheaper means?
Well, I think it's weaker both economically and it's weaker politically as well. The Iraq, and I will call this by its very value-laden term, debacle, which it was, really weakened the United States politically. It weakened its position around the world. So the United States is no longer in the same kind of leadership position that it once was. So it cannot act with the same aggression that it once did or with the same force that it once did. So it has to, as you said, lead from behind. This is not non-engagement, but it is a different kind of engagement. And I think we need to recognize that there is a difference.
What do you think awaits the world after the end of this American imperialism?
Well, I mean, again, what I'm really speaking about is the end of the American century, and a kind of imperialism is only one dimension of it, but I'm also talking about economic leadership and the failure of the United States to continue to lead the world economically. So the short answer is that I think we're going to see a kind of polycentric global system, one that is not US-led. We will see multiple centers of power. So we won't just see one big chief dominant power, but we'll see many countries cooperating, such as with the BRIC countries or with the proposed Eurasian Union, many different kinds of configurations which will represent alternatives to a purely US-led world order.
And I think this message of the end of the American era is perceived very negatively by many Americans because it has some fatalistic connotations to that. But I think many people misunderstand that what the world is really asking for is not the end of America, because the United States can still have a very productive and significant influence on the world, both politically and economically, but I guess a more fair system, a system that would be more thoughtful in a way.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think American empire, for lack of a better word, which is what we saw after World War II, was very bad for the United States. And so I think some retraction back from this global leadership is actually a good thing. It's good for the United States. We have to remember that the way that the United States got rich, historically, before World War II, was having a very, very small peacetime military. And it did not engage in most of the world's affairs. Now, it interfered routinely in Latin America, which the United States
its own backyard.
Exactly, right. So it saw it as its sphere of influence, and we can say that that was perhaps a negative thing. But the United States did not just routinely go around to the rest of the world invading countries or intervening in their affairs. Now, in part, what this did was it helped to create a very, very strong economy and a very, very strong society. So what I'm arguing is that this is actually good for the United States and it's good for the world.
Now, one thing that always surprised me is the gap between the U.S. domestic image, this shining city on a hill, the greatest force for good in the world, and how the United States is sometimes perceived abroad, because many countries see it as a very cruel and sometimes mindless bully.
Yes.
And I think the only comparison that I can think of was the Soviet Union, because it also had one impression of itself domestically and totally different impression of itself internationally. But the Soviet Union at the time had the Iron Curtain that stopped the flow of people, stopped the flow of information. But in this way, in this sense, America is different. It is a free country. People can travel. Probably they have to go an extra mile to access some of your writings, but you can still have access to it. So. What do you think explains this fact that we have such a divergence in terms of, self-image and international image?
Well, I think that's disappearing. I think we're seeing convergence. So just as you saw in the 1980s, a kind of convergence between international opinion of the Soviet Union and domestic opinion within the Soviet Union of itself, we're seeing the same thing happening within the United States. So Americans are becoming increasingly critical of their government now. And their society. But
many are still very defensive of the old American ways.
And many of them are even quite aggressive. I mean, so we can even take it to that extreme as well. And this is what worries me. In other words, the American people are becoming very, very critical of their government and very, very critical of their country. Now, this can take any number of directions. One of the directions that we're seeing it take within the United States is kind of an extreme right-wing direction led by media outlets such as Fox News and others. And so this can be a dangerous thing because the hostility that people are feeling and the pain that they're feeling from austerity and from their declining wages, increasing work hours, increasing insecurity at the workplace is manifesting itself as a kind of just generalized aggression and against other people, minorities, again, as I said before, the government.
But this is a very common phenomenon. We see that in many other countries around the world as well.
Yes, except the United States, of course, is still a very powerful country, and this could lead to very dangerous developments if people like this actually manage to fully capture state power. Now, and in fact, they already have captured state power partly. The Tea Party Congress is an example of this. So the Republican Party has become something that's quite different from what it used to be. The party always had these kinds of fringe lunatic elements within it, but now they're the mainstream of the party. So they've gone from just kind of orbiting the periphery of the Republican Party to being the core part of it. So I see that as very dangerous. Now, on a more positive side, that's being balanced by a Democratic Party that is developing a bigger left-wing faction within it to counter them. So the political character of the country is changing.
This is a very interesting conversation, but we have to take a short break. We will be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the state of democracy and capitalism with Jeffrey Sommers, an associate professor of political economy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Mr. Sommers, just a couple of years ago, maybe a decade ago, Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein were probably the two best-known American dissidents that people all around the world knew. But now we see this whole new generation of dissidents appearing in the United States. I wonder whether it is the result of just internet and some of those views getting more publicity, or that those views are indeed being more widely shared by the American public.
Well, I think it's both, actually. And the former issue that you mentioned is certainly a powerful one, working to kind of decentralize channels of information and how they flow. And it used to be, of course, that you got your information primarily from books and from major television networks. And of course, we have this fragmentation now.
Edward Said, another very prominent American intellectual, said more than a decade ago that one of the reasons for this unquestioning attitude towards the American policies among the American people was this sort of American unity that was constantly being manufactured by the American media and the American government. And you alluded to that in the first part. But manufacturing unity is not just a political task, or wasn't just a political task. It's also an economic project that was relatively easy at a time when your economy was growing and the credits were cheap. But obviously this is a major challenge when the economic times are a bit rough. Can the United States afford manufacturing unity as a political and economic value? And also, it's pretty dangerous when you lack unity in your country. You
Yes.
alluded to, public protests and disenchantment within
Right.
the population. That could lead you to civil war, not just the United States, but any other country as well.
Sure. No, it is very dangerous. But the conditions that were present for creating national unity, of course, are no longer there, just as they are no longer there in Russia. So World War II was central for both nations in terms of creating national unity. Well, hopefully we won't have World War III.
But the threat is the best unifying factor, that's what you mean?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The wars in both countries brought people together from vastly different areas, right? And they brought them together in a common purpose and a good purpose. And so that created some sense of national unity. The Cold War did the same thing, an external threat. But next was the different set of economic policies in the United States. Beginning in the 1930s, the United States moved away from the austerity policies, which it had been following right before, or I should say at the early stages of the Great Depression, and it moved towards a more equitable distribution of income. So it became a fairer society and a more equitable society. Well, in the 1980s, it began to turn away from that, and it's continued to move in that trajectory. And so now it's very hard to maintain the sense of national unity and purpose.
Now, I think what you just mentioned is a very important point, because obviously the Soviet system and the communist ideology also attempted to instill some sort of fairness by using administrative means to sort of level out those income inequalities. Obviously, the Soviet system failed, and some could argue that this was one of the main reasons for that. Income inequality in Western countries, in capitalist societies, is now probably at its highest level.
Yes.
Is that a serious danger to the system itself?
It's a massive problem because, number one, the economy cannot continue to function without demand. So we can produce way more stuff than we could consume with the given distribution of income that we have. Now, we've been fixing this in the short term since the 1980s with credit and with government debt, but both now have gotten so large that we can't use them, and that's why we've deployed austerity. But that's even worse than the two previous solutions that were deployed. So we need something new, and that new thing is the old thing. It should be a return to more New Deal-like FDR-type policies. And with respect to Russia and its view of the United States, when it had a very favorable view in the 1980s of the United States, they thought they were viewing the United States of Ronald Reagan, but they were not. They were viewing the United States of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's the America today that is the America of Ronald Reagan. In other words, his policies are now really being felt.
I find that many American and Western economists in general so indoctrinated, they sort of embrace capitalist system so just as blindly as they used to decry the communist system. But
Right.
when we look at the successful models, both among developed and developing countries, usually all successful models represent some mixture of capitalism with very generous dose of socialist
Right.
policies. Norway would be one example. China is a very different example, but they're also mixing the two. Does it mean that pure capitalism doesn't exist, or maybe it's simply not realistic in the same way that pure communism wasn't realistic?
Well, I think you're getting at a very important point. I mean, there is no such thing as just capitalism. There are many varieties of capitalism. And so the variety that we have now, I guess, is the most pure form that we've seen, although it's one which has still been constructed by the state. And that's what neoliberalism is. It's the construction of a liberal economy by the state. In other words, it doesn't happen in a laissez-faire way just by itself. The state constructs it. And it's proving to be very unsustainable. So just as you've said, where we've had these mixtures in the past of the state and the private sector working together with some significant regulation, I think this is what we need to return to. And this, in fact, is what the Japanese did as well when they successfully developed.
You just said that there are many different forms of capitalism,
Yes.
and yet whenever a developing country faces a major crisis, like for example Russia back in the early 1990s, it is always given the same advice by Western economists. That is, let your economy hit the rock bottom,
Right.
And only then your economy will be able to prime itself. When this recent crisis hit, obviously many Western economies didn't follow the advice that they
Yes.
previously dispensed to the developing countries. Is it just a hypocrisy, or simply a realization that, again, you cannot afford to follow that advice.
Yes, well, I think the economists who actually trafficked in this kind of advice, they really believe it. I mean, they're like fundamentalist zealots. I mean, they really, really believe that these economic programs work. And in terms of real-world examples, I mean, we've seen a Russia that introduced these kinds of shock therapy policies, and we've seen China's path towards capitalism, and I think we know which one worked best. Regarding the nature of it, do I think there's hypocrisy? Well, absolutely. And is there also, as you said, secondarily, this realization that these policies don't work? Yes, that as well. Although, in the European Union, they're rather slow to come to that realization.
And many of those ideas, I find them extremely deeply indoctrinated. One of them, for example, is the idea that the United States, the myth that the United States is this land of opportunity where everybody can, rise from the bottom to the top. But
yes.
There have been a lot of studies, including the one done in 2009 by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that found that the United States and Britain have some of the lowest levels of upward mobility in the developed world. And some of those countries that, on the contrary, have a very strong reading, like Nordic states, Norway, Canada, again, they have a very, very strong socialist policies and very, very high responsibilities that the governments assume. And there are a lot of people who find this as a conspiracy, that all this do-it-yourself type of rhetoric makes you feel good, but ultimately what it also does is decreasing not just the burden on the government, but also responsibilities that governments and big corporations, big businesses have to face in any harmonious society.
Sure. Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you have elites, for lack of a better term, who want to shed these responsibilities because it's work and it costs money. But in the long run, it's actually much better for society, including for those businesses and those governments, because it does create more stability. And just as you said, in many West European countries, we now see greater social mobility there than in the United States. And this is an absolute reversal of trends that we've seen for the past 2 centuries. It used to be the United States that had much higher rates of social mobility up until about the 1980s or so. And then it began to reverse. What's quite interesting and counterintuitive is that capitalism is more dynamic when the state is actually more involved. So in other words, when people have access to national health care, solid national pension systems, they can take risks and start businesses. So that's why we see in countries, say, even as Italy, much higher levels of entrepreneurship than the United States. So we need to get rid of these kind of pure Platonic ideals in terms of understanding these systems and understand that reality is more complex.
And what's interesting is that people who usually hold those pure Platonic ideas also have absolutely no problem with embracing regulation and authoritative measures when it suits them. And what I mean here is, of course, the bailout in the United States, with 85% of the population being strongly against it, and nothing, even democratic institutions and the will of the people, could prevent the government from actually implementing it. So it seems that market principles are heavily guarded only when they suit decision makers or major beneficiaries of the capitalist system.
But I think you raise a vitally important point there as well. I mean, it was really disgraceful how the crisis was handled in terms of opposing the popular will. Now, on one level, they did actually have to do something in order to restore some stability within the system, but they could have nationalized banks and do other things to ensure that credit continued to flow. But yes, I mean, now we have created a system that is against the will of the people and that is too big to fail. We've jailed no bankers that committed these heinous acts which destroyed trillions of dollars of wealth. And so it does bring into question the very strength of democracy right now. I would argue that it's quite weak.
How would you, rate the state of democracy in the United States and the level of engagement of people in the running of their own country?
It's both high and low at the same time. So there are many people who are just very alienated, very disconnected from their neighbors, from their communities. They're watching Fox News, who is always, yelling at them and getting them in this agitated state. And then, again, there are younger people who are actually getting more involved in their communities, and they're beginning to live with their communities as well.
Now, one form of public engagement that has been popularized in recent years is public protest. And we've seen that public protests happening all around the world. And in some places, for example, in the Middle East and in Southern Europe, I think you can argue that rather than being a form of expressing public's dissatisfaction with the economic conditions, public protest is now becoming a major hurdle to simply do anything within your own country, both politically and economically. Do you see that as a localized phenomenon, or is there a greater danger that something like that will spread around the world, especially given that economic hardship is still significant in many of the Western countries, and the chances that it will go deeper within the society are still pretty high?
Yeah, well, it depends, of course, upon the region, doesn't it? I mean, there are certain countries that seem to be given to pots and pans style protests and others that are not. I would argue that despite especially some big anti-war protests, the United States is a country which is not given to large protests for the most part.
But
with
they
some
occupy
exceptions.
Wall Street, for example.
Even that. It appeared quite dynamic at first, but then it became quite muted, and then it just kind of petered out, and it really didn't have any kind of transformative effect. I was very supportive of it. But it didn't have any significant long-term impact.
Well, and I think many people would agree with you. They assume this country-specific approach when it comes to public protest. For example, many people in the United States that at least I had a chance to talk to believe that what is happening in Egypt or in Syria would be impossible in the United States. And yet there are a couple of polls that I've seen in recent years that suggest that a very significant percentage of Americans, more than 40%, do not exclude the possibility of taking up arms to defend their rights. And in the United States, as you know, with the Second Amendment, arms are easily available.
Right.
So does that represent any danger, not just to the United States, but to the developed world?
We could have the rise of kind of right-wing paramilitary movements. I mean, I could see that under conditions of greater instability. And Americans are terribly well armed, dangerously so. Fortunately, this is not the same situation that we see in many other parts of the world. But these armed groups are very, very right-wing. And if they actually did begin to protest, it would be to kind of reinforce a more authoritarian state rather than weaken it. So it represents a very dangerous current, and one which I do think that we have to have some pause and some concern about.
Well, I guess we all hope that this is not going to happen, but unfortunately this is all we have time for. Please join us again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.